Okay. Loud. All right, let's get started here. Dim the lights. Okay, so pretty straightforward for today. Wow, it was warm in here when it was cold, and now it's cold in here now that it's warm. That's just the best. Okay, thanks, Tori. All right, so a couple of really quick things. Obviously, over reading week, I got your midterms marked, so that is all good. Class, like the average for it was about 78%, which is perfect for me. It's about where I expect a class of 125 people to be. It's somewhere around, somewhere between 72 and 80, and it falls right within that range. So I was pretty happy with that. Judging on some of the grades, I assume that some of you are probably not all that happy, but apparently not unhappy enough to, show up. So that's we're going to go with that. Why does the whole Tory basement smell so bad? Because this is the worst building on campus. Maybe humanities is worse, but this one's really bad. So it's also because they've got like sewer lines open all over the building because they're redoing bathrooms that they did a year ago. So yeah, it stinks in here. That's all. Okay. So yeah, I mean, if for whatever reason, you want to come, even if you did really great and you're like, oh, I want to know what 1 mark I missed or 2 marks I missed or whatever, you want to come in and take a look at your exam, just let me know, and I can schedule a time for you to come in and take a look at it. I'm on campus 5 days a week, but I have a lot of teaching, so I have to kind of work around all of our schedules here. I think that's all. I think everything's pretty straightforward. If I recall from the syllabus, our next midterm isn't until March 14th, so we got a little bit of time until the next one for you to come in and take a look, and some time to kind of go over a few more units and really put some content in. Now that I've finished my first and most horrible task, which is marking, because I'm super smart, I had 4 exams within 3 days, which meant I have been marking basically forever. And I finally got all my marking done during reading week. So I'm going to start working on some practice questions for you for the units we've covered since the midterm, and start building out a midterm 2 practice test as I have time to do so. So that'll start to populate at some point in the near future. We'll kind of go with that. Okay, I think there's obviously no questions. You look rested from reading week or not, I don't know. I'm not, so I always find reading week more stressful than anything else. But let's jump in. Okay, so last time, what were we talking about? Like Friday of a week ago. We were talking about what our ideas of good jobs, bad jobs, no jobs are, right? So job quality. So we're in job quality. Hopefully we'll finish this off either today or we will finish it off first thing on Wednesday, and then move into our next unit, which is actually talking about how labor markets work. So it's a little bit more economics-ish in its orientation. Okay, so I'm pretty sure this is about where we ended off. I could have gone and watched my own video, but no. I'm pretty sure we were talking about part-time work. Part-time, right, if I go back one slide, generally speaking, we don't think of part-time work as good jobs, right? We think of them as, maybe it was back 2 slides. Yeah, we typically like non-standard types of work, part-time, multiple jobs. Self-employed, these are all of our kinds. Own account, where you're the only one who works in the self-employed job, so you're your only employee. And then temporary and gig work. We tend to think of things like, part-time work and temporary and gig work as not particularly good jobs. Okay. Like I said last time, we've seen a big rise in a lot of these categories, especially part-time work, right? So part-time work, in 1953, oh, there's my Grammarly, was only about 4% of the market. Became more common in the 60s and 70s, especially as more women entered the workforce, and we're trying to balance, childcare and domestic responsibilities with working and making some money. And it's kind of been, it steadily rose in the mid 70s, about 13%. By the mid 80s, it was 17%, and it's kind of hovered, between 18 and 19% of the workforce since, about 1993. And it goes up, it goes down, it goes up, it goes down. Sometimes it's gone into the low 20s, but mostly kind of sits between 18 and 19%. Okay, so part-time work, like this very smiley barista lady. I was going to say baristas are really this nice, but actually, like the barista at the Starbucks I occasionally stop at on the way to work is extremely nice. Always writes nice messages on the cup and like, hope you have a great day. It's like, oh, that's so nice. Okay, so we do have gender differences in terms of kind of rates of part-time work. It's still much more common for women to work part-time, than it is for men, right? Men, and these are a few years old now, 7-year-old stats. But generally speaking, women are more likely to work part-time. And again, this is often, partially due to industry. So the industries they work in, retail especially, Retail especially tends to favor part-time, and retail is dominated by women. Um, and then, typically balancing being a mom and working at the same time, right? So we still see these kinds of trends where more women are going to work part-time, trying to balance those domestic and childcare responsibilities than their male counterparts. Okay. And yeah, about 2/3 of all part-time workers in 2012 were women, and that has remained roughly unchanged since then, right? It's still about 2/3, so only about a third are men. So youth, when we talk about young people, we'll talk about young people in the labor market a little bit later in the course as well. We've seen a ton of increase in part-time work for young people, especially as we've seen, costs, how much everything costs go up. It used to be that it was a certain socioeconomic class of young people that tended to work more part-time, right? So it would have been your poor and your working class, and let's say your middle class and upper middle class and the rich tended to not, their youngsters didn't tend to work as much. As things have gone up in cost, right? As it's become more expensive to go to school, everything just costs a lot more. That's supposed to be poor. That's an R. I have very bad writing. I'm sorry. We've seen that expand kind of into the middle class, and even in some cases into the upper middle class, where more young people from these social classes, are forced to work when they're in, high school, university, just in order to basically make ends meet and pay things like tuition, as those costs have all gone up. And yeah, it's about 48% of youth work part-time in 2018. As you get, obviously the rich, kids of the rich don't need to work unless they want to. But as we've gone, more of the middle class and upper middle class young people have started working, we've seen those numbers kind of rise. Okay. We also have voluntary and involuntary part-time. Involuntary part-time workers tend to be, they tend to be clustered in industries like retail, right? Maybe childcare, retail, childcare, and other kind of lower skill service industry jobs. And generally it is, right, they're forced to work part-time, because they can't find a full-time job, or the kinds of industries they work in don't offer full-time, usually because, they're trying to keep their workforce from getting benefits, right? And if you remember, we said, before the break that about 1/3 of total labor costs are made up by benefits. And so especially in retail and other industries that have really low margins, right? The profits are pretty low. You tend to basically want to keep people from earning too much in terms of benefits. You try to keep them under things like 35 hours. And then, of course, you have voluntary part-time, where basically people are choosing for lifestyle reasons to work only part-time, right? So this is my wife, right? She went from full-time to 0.8, so she gets every Friday off. If I seem extra salty on Fridays, it's because I'm imagining her like going for massages and stuff while I'm, hard at work. It's all good, right? But this is like voluntary part-time. You also see this with older workers, right? Our 65 plus, where seniors will need something to do, right? They might work part-time, in some kind of occupation, basically to get a little bit of income and often just to keep active. You'll see a sort of voluntary part-time amongst older workers, right? The classic example that always comes to mind for me is the Walmart greeters, right? Those old gentlemen or ladies that stand at the entrance to Walmart, and their job is to smile at you and wave and be nice and tell you, go over there for returns and all that. That's often in this voluntary part-time, right? They're not looking for full-time work. They're actually looking for part-time work just as something to do. Okay. And yeah, a ton of variation across industries and occupations. When we talk about, and we'll talk about how stratified the labor markets are in the next unit, but higher rates in service industries, especially in the lower tiers, right? In the in the lower tiers of the service industry, those less well-paying jobs, you see much more part-time. In the upper tiers, right, you will see some, but it tends to be more voluntary. The other thing that sometimes happens is you have weird occupations. So for example, nursing in Alberta, a lot of nurses in Alberta are listed as part-time employees because they take contracts that are essentially 0.6 or 0.8. And I know this because I have two cousins that are nurses. And it's sort of I don't want to call it a scam, but it's something that the United Nurses of Alberta wrote into the contract. So they take part-time, right? So 0.8 or 0.6, and then they work a ton, they take on a ton of overtime shifts, right? So, and then they get paid, at a higher rate for those shifts. So, there are some weird things where almost every nurse in Alberta is probably listed as a part-time employee, even though, they're probably working, because their contract says they're working 0.8, but they might be working like 1.2, right? Or at least one full kind of 40 hours, 44 hours a week. It's just that they take a bunch of that in overtime. Okay, because they have weird contracts. She's so happy. There we go. Okay, so why do people work part-time? And you can see there's a kind of a shift over time, right? So we got our 1975, and if we recall, we go back here, right? In the kind of mid-70s, we had about 13% of the workforce working part-time. It's about 18-19 by 2018. So why do we work part-time? Okay, so big one, right? One of the bigger chunks, more than a quarter, did not want to work full-time, right? That was a higher amount in the 70s. That has actually gone down, right? It was better than a third in 1975. This one, which is, again, a little smaller now, going to school. The big growth, if you want to see where it's grown a lot, it was 11% in 1975. 2018, it had grown by, a little over 10%, was the involuntary part-time. So we can see involuntary part-time, right? People who would like a full-time job but can't get one, has been growing over time, as has, personal and family illness. And that's interesting. What you probably see there, if we're talking about this number, is likely a lot of Gen X and older millennials. And this grouping, sometimes referred to as the sandwich generation, specifically because they're kind of pinched between two things, which is caring for children and also caring for elderly parents. So it's things like, especially as the parent, I'm older millennial. So, my parents are rounding into their late 70s now. And one thing that's, pretty true about my parents is they have a lot of doctor's appointments. Now, thankfully, my parents can both still drive. And they have vehicles and all of that. But at some point, probably as they round into their 80s, I would expect that one or both of them are going to lose their licenses, or for some reason they are not going to be able to drive. Or if it's my mom, right, she barely feels comfortable driving at all. And so, it might be if she gets sick and has to go to a lot of doctor's appointments, and my dad for some reason can't take her, it's going to be on me and my sister to have to take her to appointments, right? To take her for whatever. Old people get sick with all sorts of things. So, that's going to be a pinch. Now, my sister is a childless cat lady, so I think I can download that onto her. But, if it's me, right, I have kids and I have, elderly parents. So a lot of this number, personal, family, and illness, right, is actually, taking care of family and being pinched between older parents and having young children. And especially like weird things like demographics, as things like the age at which people have their kids, is going up, right? So mostly now we see people becoming parents for the first time in their late 20s and early 30s. More likely that you're also going to have elderly parents while you have young kids. And the fun thing about young kids is they get sick a lot. Okay, so temporary employment. So obviously temporary employment, there's a lot of different forms of it. Most common for young workers, right? Young workers make up a big part of this. So, in a couple of months, and I wish you all luck because I hear it's brutal out there. You're all going to be looking for summer jobs of some kind, to pay your tuition next year. And you're going to go, I don't know. I mean, I worked in construction when I was doing my undergraduate degree, right? I helped build buildings and do all sorts of weird stuff. I was not good at it, but that's neither here nor there. There's a reason I'm in sociology and not in something a little bit more practical. I have no spatial reasoning at all. It just is terrible. I have a friend. He's really good at building stuff. And I'm like, how would you build this? And he's like, oh, I would just, and I'm like, huh. One more time, but slower, because I've just like no idea what the hell you just said. It's like, we'll just build a honeycomb structure. I'm like, great. Explain that. And also make it for me. That would be great. Okay, so young workers. So we see a lot of, especially in construction and tourism, we have a lot of temporary workers, hired in, basically jobs in the summer, right? Our high months for tourism are summer. So you have a lot of young people hired in tourism-related jobs in the summer. And then construction, right? And you have a mix of like, adults and younger workers, older workers and younger workers working in construction. And obviously it has these big kind of peaks and troughs over the year. Now, public and private sector, but especially, this is probably less true in the Trudeau years where the public sector has really ballooned. But private sector and public sector have all gone to more people on limited term contracts. Often for a couple of reasons, right? It's flexibility, and it's, often no benefits or little benefit. Amongst other things, right? Especially if they hire people from temp agencies, whatever company is, they just pay, whatever the temp agency charges. They don't have to pay for any benefits, right? And again, like we see lots of limited term contracts, say in academia, right? In academics, where a lot of the instruction is done, it's almost half now, is actually done by temporary contracted workers. Okay, so we don't know as much about it because StatsCan only started monitoring temporary work in 1990, so we can only go back, right, basically 3.5 decades at this point. But it seems like we've seen a pretty good jump over time, right, where this is becoming a bigger part of the job market. Okay, so what do we have? About 22%, right, is seasonal, and this will include some mix of things like, construction, tourism, and agriculture. Right, so especially at around harvest time, a lot of farmers will hire temporary workers to help them with harvests. Okay, you got about a quarter of it is casual, right? So short term, no specific contract. Again, a lot of academics are like this, but lots of companies use casual contracts as well. And then, I guess most academics is limited term contracts, right? So it'd be like for a semester or for a year or for 8 months, right? We have sometimes casual short-term work, right? Maybe you're hired for a project, right? You're hired to provide administration while someone's on holidays, or to scale up some accounting while, as a project gets bigger. You see a lot of this, and yeah, limited term contracts. Again, construction, you see limited term contracts. Hey, you're hired until this project is done, and academics is the other one I tend to think of. Okay, hello. Okay, so temporary foreign workers. How am I doing for time? I'm doing good. Okay, so temporary foreign workers. So this is a kind of weird program. So temporary foreign workers in Canada, it's been around for a long time, but temporary foreign workers used to be concentrated basically in agriculture, particularly in British Columbia, right, where people would sort of come up from Mexico and other parts of Latin America on temporary work contracts and help with harvest, right? Especially fruit harvests, because they're extremely time sensitive, right? You need a huge surge of workers to harvest apples and cherries and peaches and pears and all of that. Say like in the Fraser Valley and in the Okanagan, well, there's less of that than there used to be. Now it's all vineyards, and used to be really concentrated in agriculture. In the 2000s, right, with the Harper government, so that's the conservative government of Stephen Harper, the program was largely expanded to allow for more kinds of temporary foreign workers, and to particularly allow them to come as TFWs and then apply for things like permanent residence if they were here for a period of time, right? And once they had PR, they could apply to bring over relatives and children and all of this kind of stuff. Okay, so if we look at occupations, right, one of the big ones has always been nannies and babysitters. Live-in nannies, have long been temporary foreign workers, and it's long been a pathway for women from developing countries to come to Canada, work as a live-in nanny for wealthier people that can afford a live-in nanny, and then apply for permanent residency, and then get a different job in a different industry. So, PR. Nannies, harvesting laborers, these ones always have been really short-term, right? You come up and they would work their way down, into Canada and down into different parts of the US, because the harvests hit at slightly different times, and then back in typically into Latin America. Greenhouse workers, again, agriculture. Housekeepers, that's a big one in the hospitality industry, and again, agriculture right there. And that makes up about 46%. Some higher end stuff, post-secondary research assistants, scientists, engineers. But since 2015, right? What happens in 2015? Well, you get the Trudeau government, and the Trudeau government opens the program up even more. You get, a weakening of what's called labor market impact assessments. So let me explain to you what a labor market impact assessment is. Basically, if you want to hire a temporary foreign worker in Canada, you have to file a labor market impact assessment with the government, basically saying that you posted the job locally and you received no adequate applicants. So this used to be even under the Harper government, this used to be a rather difficult process. You had to post, and there was a fair bit of scrutiny. Not a lot of labor market impact assessments were approved. Under the Trudeau Liberals, the program expanded widely, and basically labor market impact assessments became a rubber stamp, right? So basically there was some bureaucrat somewhere in Ottawa basically rubber stamping pretty much every labor market impact assessment. And so what you've had since then is a flood of temporary foreign workers coming in, especially into food service and retail, right? So, I guess the stereotype now, right, is that, your Tim Hortons is staffed almost entirely by temporary foreign workers. Part of it is that the labor market impact assessment program or process has become so easy that basically they will post, say, openings on really obscure job boards and say, oh, we couldn't find cooks or front counter workers locally, so could we have a temporary foreign worker? And it usually gets approved really quickly. Retail as well, right? So say Walmart hires a lot of temporary foreign workers, as does weirdly Canadian Tire. Canadian Tire has become a company that uses this a lot, and they've been sort of lambasted in the media for how often they use these labor market impact assessments to bring in temporary foreign workers. Okay, so I'm going to erase my stuff here because I want to explain part of the problems with the TFW program in Canada. So it's a really, okay, so most of the migrants, when we talk about where they come from, for, basically the whole of 2015 to now, so for a decade, the bulk of our temporary foreign workers have come from two countries, which is from the Philippines and from India, and particularly, the Punjab region of India, which is considerably poorer than some other parts of India in the south. Now, there are a lot of problems with this program. So one of them is that if you're brought in on a temporary foreign worker contract, you often are tied to the employer that brought you in. And so there have been ways that this program has been, shall we say, abused. For instance, let's say you're the franchise owner of a Tim Hortons, and you also own rental housing. Okay. So what you do is you house your temporary foreign workers in your rental housing. Often, right, it's been like, 10 to 15 workers living in a single house, so crowded. And then you charge them rent, right? So you pay them their salary and then you charge them rent. So you're kind of making a profit on them as they work at Tim Hortons, and you're making a profit on, 10 people paying you $600-700 rent at, in one of your housing units. Sounds great, right? Now, the problem is you can treat them like slaves because they can't leave, right? You brought them in, they are tied to you and the job that you gave them. And if you fire them or they quit, basically that is, they can't get another job, right? Because they don't have a broad work permit. And basically the next step is they get deported. And if you get deported as a temporary foreign worker, you're banned from re-entering Canada for 10 years, right? So it's not like you can just be like, okay, I'm gonna jump over, I'm gonna quit this crappy job, go back to India, and then apply again through this to get another job, right? You're gonna be banned for 10 years. So this has led to it being called by this person, Tomoya Obokata, the UN Special Rapporteur, a breeding ground for contemporary forms of slavery, which is not what you want to hear about your country, right? And a lot of these workers don't know their rights. A lot of them don't necessarily speak English or French particularly well. And so you have a lot of room for abuse. I'm trying to, there's something else about the temporary foreign worker program. The other thing, these labor market impact assessments, it's come to light that there are immigration consultants that are selling TFW jobs in places like India for $50,000 a shot, right? So there are people, in India and in the Philippines who are basically paying $50,000 for the labor market, basically for a temporary foreign worker job in Canada, done through these fraudulent labor market impact assessments. And then they come, and part of this, so they pay it to like an immigration consultancy firm. And then part of this money, right, this 50K, sometimes it's 40, sometimes it's 30, actually gets kicked back to the owner of the Tim Hortons franchise, right? So basically, the immigration consultant takes part of this 50,000 and they give a kickback to whatever company filed the labor market impact assessment. So it is it's a program that's rife for abuse, and it has been abused tremendously. And because there's not a lot of rights for temporary foreign workers, it's generally, you see a lot of poor working and living conditions coming out of it. And yeah, the growth of this, kind of worker has outpaced permanent migrants. It's become one of the largest sources of immigration to Canada is actually the temporary foreign worker program. So it has a lot of problems. I don't know if okay. No questions about how our TFW program is terrible. Okay. There we go. Okay, self-employment. We've seen kind of a general resurgence in self-employment. In the 1990s, it kind of declined. More people were, working for companies, and self-employment declined significantly. But it kind of jumped back up in the 2000s, and by 2018, about 3 million Canadians were self-employed, not counting farmers, because farmers are always self-employed, but they're never counted amongst the self-employed numbers because they're counted as a different part of the industry. Okay, so we see a lot, kind of, a growing spirit of kind of entrepreneurial culture, especially around tech. More people founding tech startups that can fizzle out, or they can become things like Shopify, right? Shopify kind of started roughly like this. And then gig workers, right? People who, work as kind of contractors for Uber or Skip the Dishes, right? Who are technically self-employed. They don't actually work for those companies. So we've seen a big boom in that. And yeah, we mostly see the growth in own account, right? Basically, you are the only person working for you versus, the self-employed employer. We see less of this, right? So you are the boss and you employ other people. That's less common than you are the only person that works for you, right? And, you can go either of these directions. Okay. Why is my phone buzzing at me? Not important. Okay. Too many WhatsApp groups. Okay. For work. They're all for work. How am I doing for time? Wow. Might actually run out of slides. Oh. I will. That's a question and a half. Yes. Actually, why don't I answer that now? Does the TFW program affect wages for Canadian workers? Okay. I'm going to go back and I'm going to answer this question because this is a good question. We're going to clear off all of it because there's an economic argument here, and it's typically, kind of as follows. So this has long been a complaint, especially by neoliberal economists, about immigrant labor in particular. You hear this in the U.S. about kind of illegal immigration and its effect on wages, right? So the TFWs probably suppresses wages. Why? Well, the argument with the TFW program is always that the reason that you're applying, you're getting this labor market impact assessment is because you couldn't find anyone in Canada that was willing to do the job that you're offering for the wage that you were willing to pay for it. Now, the typical kind of argument would be, and you'd see this, say in Austrian or Keynesian economics, is, okay, you can't find anyone that will do the job at the pay you're offering, pay more. Okay, and I'll give you some anecdotals here. In the 2000s, right, before this program really was flowing the way it has been, since 2015 and the reforms that the Trudeau government brought in for it, one of the things that was happening, right, we saw in Alberta, we had a big labor boom, right, prior to 2015 because of oil and gas, right? So oil and gas sucked up a lot of young workers because a lot of young workers went and worked in the oil patch as laborers or, working on the rigs for relatively high wages. So places like McDonald's and Starbucks were having trouble finding workers. So what did they do? They raised wages, right? So if you go back to 2015, it wasn't terribly uncommon for McDonald's to be paying employees $25, per hour. That was pretty common, right? Well above minimum wage. And Starbucks, I can't remember what their wages were. I guess I remember the McDonald's would be like, we're hiring $25 an hour, like on the sign outside the McDonald's, right? Starbucks did things, I don't remember what their wages were, but they had scholarships. So if you went and worked at Starbucks, right, you were a barista at Starbucks, they would pay for part of your university education, right? Because, when you have a labor shortage, you're able to basically, you kind of have to incentivize workers, right? They could get those wages anywhere, right? They don't have to come and work for you. And the harder and kind of grosser your job is, right? Like McDonald's, right? It's not necessarily the nicest place to work because you're dealing with a lot of stress. You're dealing with oil and grease and all of this stuff. Mean customers and all that, well, you have to incentivize people to work somehow. So it actually leads to rising wages, right? And generally speaking, we've had a kind of worker shortage in Canada because the boomers, Gen X and millennials didn't have a lot of kids. So there's not a lot of young workers to fill, especially that bottom tier of the labor market. But what happens with TFWs is they get paid bottom basement prices, right? This is minimum wage. And basically, if this program is unchecked, the argument is it's going to suppress wages for everyone because suddenly there's no pressure at the bottom end, right? So think about it this way. If McDonald's is paying $25 an hour, well, what is that high-end restaurant paying, right? Probably considerably more than that. And what is, a slightly higher tier, worker with a little bit more responsibility getting paid? Probably a little bit more than that, right? So labor shortages are going to put upward pressure on wages, generally speaking. So, but if you then bring in a bunch of unskilled workers from different parts of the world, and you can pay them all minimum wage, that upward pressure basically goes away. So I would say, based on kind of, again, I'm not an economist, I'm just a dumb sociologist, but that's okay too. I think the TFW program almost certainly puts downward pressure on wages for Canadians, right? Because if you're not willing to work for the terrible wages that Canadian Tire is going to give you, that actually works in their favor because they can bring in a temporary foreign worker who they're going to pay minimum wage, and maybe the franchisee of that particular store is then going to house them in their own housing and charge them extra, and they're going to be double dipping on these temporary foreign workers. So almost certainly there's a lot of downward pressure from this, and we probably would have seen wages rise further if there weren't as many workers, because then it's like, hey, if I want to run my Starbucks, I got to pay these workers a little bit more, right? Okay, so your latte might cost $17 instead of the $13 it currently costs, but there you go. Okay, so did I answered that question? Very nice. Okay, it's a great question. Okay, so I talked about this a second ago, right? Two types of self-employed employers, own account. And yeah, 70% of self-employed in Canada are own account, right? It's just them. More prevalent amongst men a little bit than women. Although, there's certainly something to be said. Things like Etsy certainly increased this category for women a little bit, even since 2018. Etsy and other things like that. For a long time, a lot of the own account women were running day homes. That was a big part of it, right? Basically, while they had their own kids at home, they would run basically a glorified mini daycare. And that was a lot of the own account. Yeah, a little under 20% of working men. Now, is there a correlation between economic recessions and self-employment, right? Typically has been sort of assumed that if you can't find a job, you start your own business. The correlation is actually relatively weak. We see a small increase when the economy goes down, and layoffs start of people starting their own businesses. But most of the time, people who start their own businesses actually leave a job to start a business, right? They were using their job basically to raise startup capital for whatever business they want to run. And once they have enough, they go start their own business, and off they go to the races. And yeah, it's really widely dispersed in the economy, right? There's not like one sector where you see an overabundance of small businesses, right? Of self-employed people. They're spread out across the economy pretty evenly. Okay. So, hours, which we all care about, right? Standard number of work hours per day has been declining since the 19th century. And I'll say even as economic output has gone up significantly. And this is what you tend to call productivity, right? Productivity growth, as your economy, you bring in new technologies, better ways of doing things, computers, robotics, maybe AI, who knows? I still don't know what AI is supposed to do. I'm sure someone will tell me someday. Aside from writing really terrible essays in my senior level classes, I don't know. But I'm sure there are much better applications. But the idea is, that AI will increase productivity per worker tremendously if you can figure out how to do it. Okay, so if you went back to 1870, right, the average work week was 64 hours a week, which is a lot. By the 1940s, right, it dropped to about 44 to 49 hours a week. By the 50s, late 50s, right, it was 40 hours. And in the 2000s, a typical work week is usually somewhere between 36 and 37 hours a week. So we've seen, and again, economic output has increased because we have technology that have made fewer workers able to do more, which means, their individual productivity is higher. They produce more economic benefit. Okay. Now, there is a bit of a polarization in hours worked. Some people work really long hours versus some people who work part-time. An example you might think here is like first-year associates, like lawyers, right? If you're starting as a lawyer, you can expect when you're kind of starting out, you probably work 80 hours a week. 80 hours a week, that's pretty common. So you have some industries where like really long hours are expected. People who are self-employed will often work a ton of hours because any kind of profits or economic benefits that they are going to generate, they have to generate for themselves, right? Especially if your own account, right? You're the only one that's generating more. So a lot of self-employed people work really long hours. Okay, so for some others, right, long hours are just a way to slow declines in living standards, right? This is typically your two job holders, right? Where if someone, if wages are not keeping up with, say, inflation, people might take on a second job and work, 40 hours a week or 36 hours a week at their main job and 13 hours a week at a part-time job, just to slow down kind of economic or decline in living standards. Okay, it's only about 8.5% of workers who work 50 hours a week or more. So it's a relatively small part of the economy. Okay, for time, a couple more minutes. Overtime is another one, and overtime is a kind of weird category because it doesn't apply to everybody. So basically, if you earn an hourly wage, right, your job is like dollars per hour. So you'll see this in like, the trades, retail, and some of those industries. If it's dollars per hour, you're probably eligible for overtime. If you work typically on a contract, right, you're not. And I remember this because when I worked for Enterprise Rent-A-Car, the worst company on earth, I swear. Now, there's probably worse, but Canadian Tire exploiting people is probably worse than Enterprise Rent-A-Car. But, okay, my hatred for Enterprise notwithstanding, you kind of started off and you were a management trainee, right? And you were in this category. So we worked often 60 hours a week. That wasn't terribly uncommon. but we got paid overtime. Once I got promoted to assistant manager, I was given a contract that was salary. So I was a salaried employee plus commission. Now, it turns out I did pretty well on this scheme because the people who wrote my contract couldn't do math. They miscalculated my commission percentage based on historical averages of cars being rented, which I benefited from for like 3 years until they forced me to move, or 2 years until they forced me to move. But that's neither here nor there. But I was often working 65, 70 hours a week, and I earned no overtime. I just had my salary plus my commission because, I was on a salaried contract, and not eligible for overtime. And that is pretty typical. I've known lots of engineers and other, computer programmers that were given a salary and maybe they're working really long hours, but they get no overtime because it's not, they're a salaried employee. Okay. Yes. Well, this is definitely the argument. And maybe I'll leave it here because we're almost out of time. Yeah, the TFW program is also being blamed in a lot of cases for driving up housing costs because, you have a lot of people that have been brought in, maybe as many as 5 million people in the last 10 years, adding to the kind of housing crisis we're going through in Canada. So that is a good point. All right, let's leave it there. We'll finish up. I got like a couple of slides left. Okay, more than I thought. We'll finish that up on Wednesday and we'll move on to labor markets. Okay, got a little bit excited about temporary foreign workers.